All right, so I've told you some advantages and disadvantages about different ways of collecting, data on, the behavioral consequences of personality. Let's focus in on, any specific personality measure, let's say a self-report style. How do we know whether it's a good measure of personality? Well, one way to assess that is through what we call reliability. So here we have a little target there, and you see how all of the holes are all clustered together. So this person is shooting very reliably, right? They're hitting basically the same spot over and over again. When we talk about this in terms of personality measures, what we're referring to is the ability of the test to yield consistent results. So for an individual, if they take this personality test when they're 18 and then they take it again when they're 28, well, they get basically the same score. That's one type of reliability measure, by the way. That's called a test-retest reliability measure, where you give the person the same test multiple times and they should basically score the same if the test is actually assessing a stable personality trait, right? Some kind of personality quality. So test-retest is one way we can tell whether a test is reliable. Internal consistency is a term that we use to refer to the individual items on the test, each producing the same kind of score as the overall test does. So if you're administering a test that's supposed to be assessing how shy or outgoing a person is, so you get an overall score that, let's say that they have a moderate level of outgoingness. What we would want to do with an internal consistency measure is to make sure that each of the individual items in the scale is correlating highly with the overall score on the scale. There will be some variation because questions are phrased differently and things like that, but you want to see that basically each item is correlating well with the overall score on the test. And by well, I mean, we usually are looking at a score on a correlation coefficient, which can range from 0, meaning they're not correlated at all, to 1, which means they're perfectly correlated. We usually want to see an internal consistency score for each item being about 0.7, closer to the 1 for sure than to the 0. So that's one way to measure, the quality of a personality measure. Another is what we call validity. And what you'll notice here is that all the holes are exactly on the bullseye now. Like the shooter is actually hitting what they're trying to hit, and it's clustering together, right? So they're all right there on that dot. With validity, what we're talking about is the ability of the test to measure what it claims to measure. This is probably the biggest problem with all psychological tests, intelligence tests, personality tests, everything that we try to assess. Are we actually measuring what we're claiming to measure, or are we measuring something else? We're going to have to take it on faith throughout a lot of our discussion in this class that the scales are measuring what they claim to measure. Like I said, there are psychometricians whose job it is to try and figure out, the value of scales, and they assess validity and reliability and give us actual statistical numbers to help us to decide which scale is probably the best measure of a trait or a quality. But there are different types of validity, and I wanted to discuss just briefly a few of them. One is called the face validity, and that's really whether the questions on the test look on the face of it like they're measuring what they say they're measuring. So, for example, on the Big Five inventory, there's a question that says, I see myself as someone who is talkative. It's like pretty clear on the face of it that they're probably getting at outgoingness, right? I'm talkative. I'm probably measuring outgoingness. Like they don't try and hide their purposes in the Big Five inventory. They just ask questions that on the face of it look like they're asking about what they're asking about. Criterion validity, on the other hand, is whether the score on the test relates to some other criterion. So, for example, if I let's stick with the Big Five inventory and the extroversion introversion thing. So if I administer that scale, and let's say you take it and you score in the extroverted side of the scale, and then I ask your 5 closest relations. It could be relatives, it could be friends, it could be whoever you say, or these are the people who know me the best. And let's say I interview them and I ask them to describe you. And the criterion for the test now becomes, does the test give the same outcome as your 5 friends gave in describing you? So if your 5 friends say that you are more shy than outgoing, and then the scale says you're more outgoing than shy, I'm going to say that it's not a very valid scale because it didn't meet the criterion. These 5 people who really know you say that you're more shy than outgoing, and the scale says that you're more outgoing than shy. It hasn't met the criterion. So when we talk about criterion validity, we're using something else as the benchmark for what the score should be on the test, and then we look to see whether the test actually produces a score that's consistent with that criterion. It could be, like I said, interviewing people who know the person. That's really common in personality scale development, is to interview people who know the person and see if the test produces the same outcome as the people who know them. Another way to do it is when you're developing a new test that is really assessing the same quality as an existing test, you can administer both at the same time. And so you know that the existing test is valid. It's a valid measure of the concept. So when I give you my new test, your 2 scores should correlate with each other, right? Like if my new one is a valid measure, it should correlate with the score that you got on the known valid measure. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to establish criterion validity. The key thing is I just really want to reassure you that, we in psychology of all sorts, and especially in personality psychology, have, people whose careers are dedicated to developing these kinds of scales and making sure that they're valid. The last kind of validity I listed there is construct validity. And construct is another word for theory. So is this scale valid in light of the theory that it's supposed to be testing? So I mentioned in a previous lecture that the Myers-Briggs inventory is supposed to be measuring aspects of Jungian personality. So we would want to make sure that the parts of the theory that Jung put out are really represented by the questions on this scale. So you would want to review Jung's theory, see what he predicts about different traits or qualities, and then make sure that the items on the scale really are validly representing those things. So this is how we evaluate, and this is really just a simplistic presentation. If you ever have the opportunity, I'm assuming you're taking personality theory because you might be a future or current psychology major. If you have the opportunity to go a step further and take a test and measurements class, you learn a lot more about reliability and validity, and you get a lot more confidence in these scales because you see the work that is done to make sure that they are measuring what they're claiming to measure, and that they are, providing consistent results. All right. So how do we go about personality research? Let's start with the gold standard, greatest way of ever knowing anything securely, and that is the experiment. Before I go through all the details of what an experiment includes, I thought it would be useful if I described a study and then kind of broke down the parts of it in the next slide. So I pulled one that's kind of related to personality. It's from 2013, Helping Yourself by Helping Others, Examining Personality Perceptions. You kind of notice a lot of these personality reports are coming out of business journals. So this one's out of the Journal of Managerial Psychology. All right, so the basic premise of this study: undergrad psych students assigned to assess an employee's personnel file, and they all read the following example of the employee's behavior. So this was a real person's personnel file. So there was a whole bunch of stuff in the person's personnel file. They took out all references to the person's name, so that it was, protected that person's anonymity. And then it also had the double benefit of it took out any reference to the sex of the person that was being assessed. So these undergraduate psych students were given this person's personnel file, and in amongst all the other things that were in the file was this example of the employee's behavior. So everybody saw this same beginning to the story. Once I was in a panic because I had to make copies of some presentation. So by the way, this isn't the employee who wrote this. This is somebody who wrote it about the employee. Once I was in a panic because I had to make copies of some presentation materials for an important meeting the next morning. The copy machine broke down on me and would not collate or staple the pages. It was 5:15 and all the support staff was gone and everyone else was preparing to go out for another coworker's birthday dinner at 6 o'clock. We'd all been looking forward to it. I ran around looking for help to manually collate and staple the 500 pages. So all of the undergrad psych students saw that beginning to the story that was written by somebody describing the employee that is being covered by this personnel file. Now, the independent variable, which I'll describe in a second what that means, the psych students were randomly assigned to one of two conclusions to this story. One conclusion was when this employee heard what had happened, they offered to help me even though they would miss part of dinner. The other conclusion to the story was when the employee heard what had happened, they said they could not help me because they were on their way to the party and suggested I try to find a copy center that was still open. So what they're manipulating here is half of the psych students heard the employee behaving in an altruistic way, staying late to help their coworker, even though that would cause the employee to miss part of the birthday dinner. And then half of them heard the employee being described as, not being helpful and just pointing them to a copy center that might have the appropriate gear. Now, the dependent variables, which I'll describe in a second exactly what that means, is they were comprised of these different ratings that the undergraduate students gave of the employee being described. So there was the personality traits of neuroticism, extroversion, and openness. So the student had to say how neurotic they thought the employee was, how extroverted they thought they were, how open to experience they were. Then they had to rate them on advancement potential and then give reward recommendations about what kind of boost in income or whatever reward the undergrad student thought that the employee deserved. What they found was that employees who engaged in altruistic behavior had greater advancement potential, according to the undergraduates, and greater reward recommendations, and then were perceived as more emotionally stable, more extroverted, more open to experience, more agreeable, and more conscientious. So this is what we call an experiment, where the researchers had control over the end of the story for the participants, right? For the undergrad students who read the employee file. And then they were able to discover that with just that one little manipulation, presenting the employee as altruistic or presenting the employee as, kind of, unhelpful, the undergraduates rated them differently on personality traits. They thought they were more emotionally stable, more extroverted, more open to experience, more agreeable, and more conscientious. This is what experiments can do for us, is when we see that one variable different, this outcome versus that outcome to the story, can have an impact on the ratings. Like, you might be thinking to yourself, well, maybe the students who read the altruistic conclusion had a different perspective or were somehow different in demographic characteristics or other factors that would impact their responses. I will explain now how we know from an experiment that it's probably not individual differences between the college students, but instead really this thing that was manipulated, the end of that story, is what the important factor was. So let me explain how we know that from an experiment. All right, so first off, in every experiment, there are variables. Variables are factors that, I couldn't think of it any other way to describe it except for to use the same word, so factors that vary in some way. So in the case of the independent variable, we have something that the experimenter controls, right? Like the experimenter gets to decide what you experience in that independent variable. And we call the group that gets that treatment the experimental group, and we call the control group the one that doesn't get it. So in the example that I just gave you, the experimental group would get the altruistic ending to the story, and the control group would get the unhelpful ending to that story. Now, it's really super important that the experimenter has control over that independent variable. It's something that the experimenter gets to assign you to. And I'll explain why that's so important in a second. The other kind of variable is the dependent variable. And this is something that the participant produces. So our hope is that they will produce different responses based on their experience with the independent variable. We're hoping that the experimental group will give different responses than the control group does. So in the experiment that we just saw, that's exactly what they found, is that the respondents who heard the altruistic ending produced different ratings of the employee's personality, their advancement potential, and their deservingness of rewards than the respondents who were in the control group. The ones who heard the unhelpful ending gave different personality ratings and gave different reward potential and advancement potential. So when you're deciding whether an individual participant is going to be in the experimental group or the control group, the quintessential important factor of an experiment is that those participants are placed in those groups randomly. Every participant has an equal chance of being placed into the experimental condition or the control condition. That way, any individual differences that exist between the respondents or the participants will be distributed between the experimental and the control group. And that means now there won't be any systematic differences that are attributable to individual differences that the participants brought with them. So the experimenter needs to be able to control that independent variable and make the assignment of experimental or control condition, because that assignment needs to be random. All right, let's stop here. Think about that as the experiment. We will come back in the next segment and we'll talk about, I forgot my coup de grace here, my kicker, my last part. Experiments are the absolutely only way. The reason why we call this the gold standard of research is that they are the only way to establish cause and effect relationships. Because we have control over the independent variable and we use random assignment, we're able to make the assertion that, which ending you heard to that story caused your ratings of the employee's personality and advancement potential and so on. Okay, now I wanted to go here and say, in the next segment, let's talk about quasi experiments, which are related to experiments but are not quite experiments. All right, I'll see you then.